And I will say firstly that it is a tricky kind of workshop to run for a number of reasons. One of them particularly is we've got to show how this room functions to a bunch of people who will be using it as hosts when they're not actually hosts. So what you're going to see in many ways is requests from us to not to click on everything in the room just yet, because it will make the room behave as if you were the host. So if that's confusing you already, then my work here is done, but we will get into the workshop and all will be made clear, I promise. So we've got about 40 minutes or so. There will be time for questions in between each of the sections. We're going to look at an introduction to how to use this tool as an academic for student lectures, tutorials, etc. And really try and cover all of the broad areas where people have problems. So what I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping first. As I said, the session is being recorded. I would ask, if you can, not to click straight away on things in the link share at the moment, because that will definitely take all of us to the same websites. So try to avoid that pod just for the minute, please. But you can definitely download the cheat sheet document that goes with this workshop over here in the file share area. And Michelle has also provided a document there about recording. So all of these will be made available afterwards, but if you'd like to click on things now, you can certainly grab them there. In terms of our communication during this session, you're more than welcome to use the chat pod. Obviously, I expect everyone to be speaking with each other in there, but if you've got a specific question that you'd like me to address, if I can get to it in the session, I will, but your best bet is to actually type it into this Q&A pod area. That way I've got a record of specific for Lachlan questions on Adobe Connect, and I will get back to those. Thanks very much. Now, I've also put in here a link to a Bridget session. So I think what I'm going to need to do at some point is make everyone a participant so that you can all see that Bridget session and get the view of exactly what I'm doing as a host. So I'll get to that a bit later on, but that's why there's a Bridget link in there. We've put 2 polls in the room at the beginning as well to get a bit of an idea where everyone's coming from, so feel free to fill those out. It's just asking which division you're from and what your intention with the tool is, and you can certainly click on multiple responses in there. That's just a little bit of background information for us, and also provides a good way of kicking things off, because we can see that we've got a spread of people from different divisions and that everyone has a lot in common with what they use this tool for. If they want to use it for tutorials, or they're thinking about assessment, or just for straight out meetings, etc., there's certainly some commonality in there. So let's get into it. If you've got a specific question that urgently requires my attention, by the way, you are welcome to go up to the top of the screen here and raise your hand using the status button. You'll see a little white figure with a hand raised, and you can click on that, and I will step aside and deal with it directly. I've also got Michelle Langham in the room, who's another Adobe Connect support person, and between the two of us we should be able to get you out of trouble. Alright, so I'm going to get straight into terminology. You'll hear people talking about bits and pieces within Adobe Connect, and whenever a term comes up that you're not sure about, feel free to put it into the chat pod and we'll deal with it, but I'll try and cover off some of the most relevant ones. Firstly, a term you're going to hear used again and again and again is pods, and a pod in Adobe Connect refers to one of these grey boxes. Okay, and there are different types of pods. Some pods are for you to use as the host in the room, the person controlling where things are and what's going on, and some of the pods allow for students to do things like a chat pod, for example, they can type into. So pods, we're going to look at a whole bunch of different beginner pods, and so you'll just hear me use that term quite a lot. You'll also see a menu at the top of your screen that says pods, and if you click on that without selecting any of those items, you would be able to choose a variety of pods in your own rooms. Again, that might make a bit more sense to you watching the recording afterwards, but for now you can definitely, you're not limited to a certain number of pods or type. You get to customize those in your meeting rooms, and I'll show you how that's done. The other term I'm going to introduce to you early on is layout, and in Adobe Connect, in the context of Adobe Connect, the layout refers to your entire room and the pods within it. So if you think of it like a room in the house and the pods as furniture, which you can move around and do things with, you have control over your layout. You can create different layouts for different purposes if you want to, but that's probably going a little bit too far at this point. So pods and layouts is where we'll start. Okay. Quite often we get asked how the layout for the room, or more particularly the wallpaper in the background, can be changed. Everyone has different tastes, etc. And you're able to do that as a host in these rooms by using the meeting menu and clicking on the preference button. And if you'd like to see what that looks like, I'm going to share my screen for a moment so you can. And I'll make my share pod, which is down here, a bit bigger. And I'm just going to put it over the top of these others. You can see I'm moving the furniture around already. I'm going to share my screen and show you exactly what I'm talking about. So if I get into my Adobe Connect room, which of course I can't do when I share my screen. Brilliant. Not exactly what I had in mind. Anyway, you might have to take it from me if you can't see the meeting menu at the top and the preference option under meetings. There is an option in there to change the wallpaper and upload your own image. So you can absolutely do that, and you can watch in the recording how I've done it as well. So quite often we get asked, it's such a small thing, but people want to customize what their rooms look like, or maybe have a background image that's relevant to their subject. You can change that using the preferences. If we actually start looking now at what different pods do, I'll walk you through those. And I'm going to do that by moving everyone into a blank layout and then adding these pods one by one. So don't get too worried that all of these pods and boxes are going to disappear. They will all reappear in just a moment, so I'm going to introduce them one by one. So ready, here we go. We're going into a blank layout, and I'm going to start adding some pods into the room. So the first pod I'm going to add in is a chat pod, and as soon as I add it in, it fills up the entire screen. So I need to readjust this furniture by moving my mouse to the edge of the box, resizing things. So we now have a chat pod that we can each talk within. I can put an instruction in there and everyone else can see that, and they can put their own things in as well. That's the chat pod. At the top of every pod, in the top right hand corner, there is a menu, and you have some control over the way that that pod behaves using that menu. So if you click on that, you'll see a few options. Hide is the first one, and that basically means close it, so avoid that one if you can. But you can do a variety of things through the chat menu, like changing the color of your text, or emailing all of the text in your chat pod to yourself. You can do that as well if you want a full history of what's going on in the chat. Okay, I'm back in the room. It looks like I'm trying to run too many things at once, but that's okay, we'll persevere. We're back in our empty layout with our chat pod. I'm just going to push on ahead. The next pod I'm going to add into this room is an attendees pod, and this tells me who else is in the room with me, and you can all see yourselves again. Now the attendees pod is important because it also shows who's speaking. Next to my name, for example, you can see a microphone icon, and that's got radio waves coming out of it, showing that I'm talking and that hopefully everyone can hear me. And next to all of your names, for example, I can see a mute button. So you've turned your mics off, so that's great. But if, as a host and even as a presenter, you can hover your mouse over the top of anyone's name in the attendees list and control certain parts of their experience. You might be able to mute them. You can move them around in terms of their roles. There's another part of our terminology. You could make them a participant, for example, or you could make a student a presenter, which would give them a bit more control in the room. But all that happens by using the attendees pod and hovering your mouse over the top of people's names. And again, in the top right hand corner of the pod, there is a menu that gives you access to some options like muting everyone, unmuting everyone, and you can also change the way that your title and other things appear in there. So again, all of that happens through the pod menu. Next pod we're going to introduce is a notes pod, and that is a straight blank empty text pod that a host or a presenter can type in, but the students cannot. It's a very basic text editor. It doesn't really allow a lot except for bullet points, colored font, and making the text bigger and smaller. So you can copy and paste from Word into there if you need to, but it's only going to do text. And most commonly the chat pod ends up getting used for things like putting in your agenda items or a to-do list, for example, as you're presenting. If things come up during the session that you might want to remember later, you can put it in the notes. If you're running a meeting, someone might like to take minutes in there, for example. Straight text, that's what the notes pod gets used for. I will point out that any of the pods can have their titles at the top of the pod changed by double left clicking on the title, and then you can change it to whatever you like. So I've called that one a note pod. I'll change the chat pod to communal chat because that's what it is. You might not necessarily agree with what's what. I could change attendees to something like who's here. You can rename pods if you need to, if you want to. It's customizable. Okay, let's get some more pods happening in here. Next pod I'm going to add is a file share pod. Again, it makes it full screen to begin with, so I'm resizing it. And I'm going to call that a file share, just to be a little bit more explicit in terms of what happens. And a file share means that you can upload documents, files of any type into the room for students to download. As a presenter and a host, you can click on the upload file button and put in any document that you want, and it will load it into the room for other participants to download. But just a word of advice on that front, you really should load it into the room before the live meeting because it can slow down the experience. So if you've got files that you want in your live session, upload them into the file share pod before it happens. And again, the menu at the top right hand corner of the pod will give you the options that you need to remove files from in there. If you're cleaning up after a session, you can select the object, go to the menu and remove it if you want to, like I've just done. But again, always look to the menu if you're not sure how something is to be done, if it's not immediately apparent. Next pod we're going to have a look at is the web links pod. I generally rename this as a link share because that's what it does. So I've resized it, I'm moving it in here. And that can be used by hosts and presenters to put in addresses to various websites that students can either click on themselves or you can force them to look at, basically, if you need to. So I'll put an example in there. I'm going to put in the Sydney Morning Herald address for no particular reason. I've added that through the menu, adding a link, and now there's a link in there that says SMH, which people can select and click on the Browse To button. And I'll just see how many people actually try and do that now that I've put it in there. It will open that website. There we go, there's one, and it gets everyone in the room to open the same page on their own computer. So that's what happens when a host or a presenter clicks on Browse To. So you'll need to jump back into your Adobe Connect meeting room now to see the room, but it's a good lesson. Participants in the room, students who do not have a presenter or host role, can click on that Browse To button and it won't affect anyone else. When a host or a presenter does it, it makes everyone in the room open the website. And that's why the link share button is important, because you may very well want students to all open a web page together at the same time, and that's how you get them to do it. Use the link share, you as the host click on browse to, and they're all on the same website at the same time. So that's a link share. Next pod I'm going to add in is one that we didn't use in our first room, but you may very well want to use, and that's the video pod. The video pod actually refers to a webcam. So I've renamed this one Facilitator Webcam because that's basically what's going on. And that, assuming you've got a webcam on your laptop or your PC, etc., will allow you to click Start My Webcam, and then you can see me, for example, in the room. And if you want students to be able to turn theirs on as well, you can enable that again by hovering your mouse over them in the presenters area or participant area and enabling their video. I will make a comment at this point that using a webcam in a live streaming environment uses the largest amount of bandwidth possible. So it could have an impact on either your students' viewing experience or your own. So everyone's internet connection can differ, basically, how much bandwidth they've got either at home or wherever they are. And when you start turning on objects that use larger amounts of bandwidth, like a webcam, they have an impact. So what I'm going to do at this point is actually pause my webcam, which will take a snapshot of me in this pose, and it still leaves my image in the room, but it doesn't use any more bandwidth at that point. So if it's paused, not using any bandwidth. So that's the webcam. And you may very well choose to use that, or you might like to load an image of yourself into the room so that the students can see what you look like without having to worry about video. And I'll show you how to do that right now. So the next pod we're going to have a look at is the share pod. And arguably the share pod is the most important pod that you can use to begin with in Adobe Connect. It's certainly the most popular one. Now I'm going to put that front and center here in the room, and I'm going to retitle it as well. So what this pod actually does is share my screen, and it also allows me to share documents. So I've retitled it using clicking up the top, and you can see a large button in the center of it that says Share My Screen. So just a word on that before we get into it. Just like using a webcam, sharing your screen, your live screen, creates a live video stream. So it uses a large amount of bandwidth at that point. So I can turn that on, choose which monitor I want it to show, assuming you've got multiple monitors plugged in, and then you are taken through in the room looking at the screens that I'm looking at. So it's a live stream. You can see if I'm moving things around, clicking on things, you're taken to those different spots. And it brings up a little dialog box in the bottom right hand corner that allows me to not only see what's going on in the chat pod, but also to stop sharing if I need to. And it does have an interesting feature in it. It allows you to actually pause and annotate what it is that you're sharing. So I've been looking at this website. I can hit that pause and annotate button, and it's taken a snapshot of it and brought us all back into the room. And I can now, if I want to, start drawing on that snapshot. So that may be something that you choose to do at some point. If you've taken a picture of something and you want to point out something that's particularly important, you can take a snapshot when you're sharing, come back into the room and annotate. I'm going to continue sharing by hitting the resume button, and if someone would like to type something in the chat pod for me just for a second, I can demonstrate how in a recording I'm able to see what's going on in the chat pod when I'm sharing my screen and still respond to that. So anyone? Or it could just be me. Michelle's typing something, thank you. Okay, great. So yeah, even though I'm sharing my screen and I can't see my meeting room, I can still see that dialog box. So thank you, Michelle. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point. it's reverted back to this empty box for screen sharing, and I'm going to talk about the way that the SharePod is used predominantly by academics at CSU. And that is to load in documents that have been pre-prepared somewhere else. So there's an arrow, a drop-down arrow next to the Share My Screen option, and when you click on that, it gives you the option to share a document. At that point, you are able to browse your own computer and upload a document that you've prepared, but I'm going to say at this point it will not work with Microsoft Word documents. So you need to use either PDF documents or PowerPoint documents. So what I've loaded in here is a PDF, and you can see down the bottom there are some controls for what I want to do with that PDF. I can zoom and make it larger if I want to. I can navigate up and down through the pages or use the scroll bar to the right hand side. I can flip it, and what you can see at the moment, because all of us are presenters or hosts, is that when we move that object around, everyone else in the room moves with us. And that's because down in the bottom right hand corner of the pod you'll see a button that says sync. And if that sync button is depressed or coloured grey as it is now, it means that all of us see the same things together. So if I navigate through this document like so, all of you are coming with me. And if you're ever in a situation where you're doing that and you're getting messages in the chat pod from students saying, I can't see what it is that you're talking about, what page are you looking at, etc. All I can see is the beginning. It's the first place to check is that sync button, because if it's not on, you're leaving it up to them to move through that shared document. So that's the sync button, and it's quite common to have that error come up. People are not sure why students can't see what they're doing. The other thing to point out is at the top of the SharePod, we've got a button that says Draw. And that means that any document that you load in here, PDF, PowerPoint, an image, whatever it might be, you can click on the Draw button. It brings up this little menu along the side with markers, etc., and you can start choosing a color and start annotating whatever's in there that you want to mark up to bring people's attention to certain things. They can see those. You can do it on each page or each slide. But it doesn't affect the document itself. So it hasn't edited the document, it's just how we view it in here. You can click on the draw button again and it will make those disappear, but not be deleted. So I can click it again and there they are. If you do want to get rid of them, then you can select those objects. There's a little selection tool at the top of that bar at the top there, and I can select each part and hit the trash can and get rid of each of those. So your annotations can be removed if that's what you're wanting to do. You can certainly select them one by one and remove them, but just hitting the draw button will turn them off as well. So that's loading a PDF in here. I'm going to stop sharing, which will unload that shared document, and now load in a PowerPoint document. Let's assume that I've got one. And again, good practice, load whatever it is you need in your SharePod before the session. It won't slow down anyone else, and certainly you won't have to wait for it. And the difference now in PowerPoint, you can see, is in the navigation underneath. All you've got is some arrows to work through the slides. Yes, any transitions that you've got are preserved, but it's not exactly as powerful as using PowerPoint itself, but it still allows you to turn the draw on and mark them up if you wanted to. So you've got your slides in here. I've turned on the marker tool, the annotation, and I can draw things in here, or I could turn the text tool on and type things in there if I needed to. And again, those aren't editing the file itself, you're just marking up over the top of it. So that's using the annotation tool. Now, same principle as before when we talked about the sync button. If it's turned off, people would need to move through the slides by themselves. Otherwise, make sure it's kept on. There is a little menu, a sidebar menu, that you can turn on that's down next to these arrows underneath, and that will allow you and the other participants in the room to move through different slides. So I can see different people clicking on different parts of that, and that's what happens if you turn the menu on. People have the ability to navigate through the slides by themselves, which is fine, I guess, unless you're trying to present it, at which point maybe you want to turn the menu off, for example, or maybe you turn it on later on and say, right, you can work through that yourselves. I'm not going to take you through those slides. So the lurks and perks of the menu bar, basically. So I will turn that off, and I'm going to click on stop sharing. Again, get familiar with the menu bar, top right hand corner of the pod. For the share pod, it's different. It allows you to do a few other things apart from using the draw tool. It allows you to turn on drawing for participants. So if you want all the people in the room to be able to draw, they can do that. You just turn it on in there, and usually that's the first question we get asked. How do they mark up the documents as well? If I've loaded an image in there and I want them to be able to draw on it, how do we do it? So you go up into the menu and enable participants to draw. Okay. So you can also see that we get notifications as presenters that show us what's going on with participants in the room. And if people have done anything using the status bar at the top of the screen, the little white hand raise bar, there's a drop down menu next to it that actually allows you to convey a whole bunch of information, whether or not people agree or disagree with something you're saying. So for example, I might stop at this point and say to everyone, is everyone okay with where I'm at the moment? Am I going too fast? Use the agree or disagree button in the room to sort of indicate where you're up to, and I can see straight away in the presenter area in the attendees pod that a number of you have ticked agree, you're okay with the speed that things are going, and that's a way to kind of take a bead on the group without I guess stopping things altogether. They can always use the status bar to indicate what's going on. So it's not just for putting your hand up to use the mic, for example. It's also about being able to get buy-in from the group. So that's why the status bar is important. Okay, so I'm aware that time's getting away from us, and I'm going to bring us back into our main workshop room at this point. So I'm going to jump across into that layout. We've covered all of the basic pods: chat, attendee, webcam, notes, link share, file share, and screen and document share. So we've gone over a whole lot of stuff very, very quickly, and there's a few more very important items that we need to canvas. One of them is recording. How do I record sessions in Adobe Connect? And basically that's done as a host. You're able to click on the meeting menu at the top and select record meeting. Now I'm showing that, and in the recording it'll show it being done as I'm doing it, but once you hit record meeting, it asks for a name for the meeting, so make sure that that's detailed enough with a date, for example, so it tells you what's going on. So maybe I can put in Adobe Connect workshop recording and a date, 20th of the 7th, 18. So at least I'll know, looking at that file in future, exactly what it refers to. We get a notification in the top right hand corner saying it's being recorded, and I can either stop the recording or pause the recording. So you may very well only have a section of your online meeting that you want recorded, so you can start and stop that using pause, not stop. If you hit stop on that record button at the top right hand corner, it will finish the file off and you'll need to launch another recording from the meeting menu. So pausing the recording is fine, and then you can resume. There'll be no impact on the recording. Or if you hit stop recording, that's it. At that point, you'll need to do something with that recording file. So I'm going to hit stop recording now, and I'm going to look at how to make that recording available for other people. So what happens at that point is the host wanting to get their recording and make it available to other people would need to go up to the meeting menu, top left hand corner, and the first option that's in there says manage meeting information, which I'm clicking on. Again, this is all being captured in the recording that I'm making, by the way, so if you can't see it exactly as I'm seeing it, that's okay. I'll just talk you through it and then you can see it in the recording exactly. Here's my recording information I've moved onto the screen, and it allows me to choose a recordings tab, and I'm going to turn on no, I won't, never mind, I'm just going to get straight to the recordings. I click on the recordings tab, the title that I just chose that says Adobe Connect Workshop Recording and the date, and next to it there's a little picture of a padlock that says private. At that point I'm going to turn on my share screen so you can see exactly what I'm looking at. There it is. This is the back end of Adobe Connect, and I'm looking at my recordings tab, and there's that recording that I've just made and it says private. First thing to do is that I need to check the box next to the recording name and click on access type and change it from private to public. Hit save. It now says that it's public. Now I want to actually make that recording available to my students, so I've made it public, but how would they know where it is? So I've clicked on the recording link. It gives me a little bit of information, how long it is, etc., and a link. This is the most important part, the link. So I'm going to left click and drag from the right hand side like so to highlight that link. Then I'm going to hold down Control C to copy the link. You can right click and click on copy, but I prefer to do it this way. It's copied, and now I'm going to jump into my Interact 2 site. Now you may or may not have an online meeting item like this added to your navigation bar in i2. If you don't, you can request for it to be added by lodging an SRS request, but it does make it very, very easy to share recordings. So I've got one here, and the very first item I can see is a schedule that shows the dates for the meetings, the topics, and when I have the links after the meetings, I can put them in here. So I'm going to turn my editor on, and I'm going to edit this first item, the schedule, populate the date. I'll just make this a bit bigger so we can see what's going on. Populate the date, so it's the 20th of the 7th, 18. I had an Adobe Connect workshop, and the link I want to go in here, and then I'm done. I can hit submit, assuming that I can see the submit button. There it is, and now it's available to students. So I might send them an announcement saying your meeting recording is now available, or I could put it on the landing page, whatever. But this is where they'll know each week to come in and get their meetings. Presumably this has been pre-populated with when the meetings are going to be held and what they're about, and all you need to do after the fact is come in here and paste the links in. That's it. You'll also notice in this online meeting item, underneath is a link to launch the meeting room for students, and it tells them what to do, and also there's a diagnostic there if they need to test their connection to find out that everything's going to work as intended, and a little bit of background information which generally no one reads. That's the online meeting item, as I said, and if it's not a part of your navigation bar on your subject site, you can just lodge an SRS request and ask for it to be added, and it can be used and reused, basically. So that's the item. So I'm going to stop sharing this particular screen, jump back into our meeting room together, and so we've looked at recording a session, making it available to students. We've also looked at the online meeting navigation bar item. I might make a separate recording about editing, because most of the time just making the recording session available to students after the fact is a good start, but if you're keen on knowing more about how to edit the recording, cropping bits out of it, I will make a separate recording for that and make it available. The last point that I have in there is about pre and post planning activities, and all that's referring to is the idea that before you launch an online session with a student, or a group of students, which is meant to be interactive and allow them to do things in the room, perhaps you've given them tasks or readings that they're meant to have done, or some preparation that they might want to think about. Similarly, after the session, there might be things that you've discussed in the online meeting that have a follow-up activity. So you may have raised particular questions in the online meeting that you want them to discuss on the discussion board afterwards. So at that point, you might have covered that off in your live session, and we'll continue the topic, or I'll answer those particular questions on the discussion board. Just about making connections between what happens in the live session and what happens during the afterwards and before, etc. So we've covered off a hell of a lot very, very quickly, introducing you to the basics of using Adobe Connect. But certainly if you have specific questions, I'm going to hang around for the next 10 minutes or so. I'm happy to answer those. Feel free to grab any of the links or files, and the recording for this particular session will be made available to all of you via the OLM Educator Hub in just a minute. So thanks very much. Happy Friday, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.